Hello. Hi, my name is Mike Corelli, and this is the Introduction to International Relations class online. Welcome. Hey, I'm very happy to be here with you today to introduce you to the several theories and perspectives used in international relations theory, and to presage levels of analysis that we'll be touching on more in depth next week, but collectively tools that we will be using throughout this course to more deeply understand international relations in our contemporary world. Again, welcome. We begin, as we always begin, with our seminar question. Remember, a seminar question is simply a capstone exercise that's intended to take full use of the textbook reading, the recorded lecture, and any supplemental reading and thought that you might have that culminates in a 2.5 to 3 page essay that's due on the date established in your Canvas platform. A seminar question is simply an opportunity for the student to show their understanding of the content that's being presented. It's also an opportunity to sharpen our essay writing skills and our communication skills. So the seminar question, as we did last week, will be transformed magically at the end of today's lecture into a thesis statement from which I'll hope to give you a good outline that you might choose to use or to echo in your own essay. Our seminar question for this week then is, choosing an historical era different from that which you used for our History of the Nation-State exercise, please interpret the actions of the nation-states therein using two comparative perspectives. Okay, so last week, you remember in our History of the Nation-State lecture, our seminar question asked you to pick an historical era to examine. Well, this week, I'm asking you to go back to that same lecture and to pick another historical era, different from the one that you chose for last week's essay, to examine by interpreting the actions of that era using two of these new perspectives that we'll be introducing today. Okay, so I'm just going to introduce the seminar question here and leave it there. We'll come back at the end of today's lecture to reintroduce it and to flesh it out a little bit. Okay? And so our roadmap for today is fairly simple. What are we going to cover? Well, we're going to look at these perspectives, these theoretical perspectives in understanding international relations. Using these perspectives to look about us today, entering this third decade of the 21st century, and help us to try to make sense of the complex events that we see going on about us. Now, as I'm going to suggest in this lecture, this isn't just for use today. What we're doing, what we're hoping to achieve, is to inculcate in your minds the capacity, the ability, the skill of opening up a paper either today or tomorrow or next year or 5 or 10 or 50 years from today to be able to use these different perspectives to look at what's going on and to understand the world around you. Okay, so how do we do this in the context, then, of international relations? How do we make sense of complex events? By utilizing theory. We'll talk about theory in a moment and how it works, especially in the social sciences. We're going to talk about the purpose of theory specifically in international relations, and then we're going to throw in a spoiler that's going to throw everything up in the air and make you think even further about the use of theory, which is the difference between positivism and post-positivism. Don't worry about it yet. We'll come to that. So today provides a snapshot of the theories we will examine in far greater detail further on in this course. We will learn how to apply these theories to understand, as I suggest, events in the world around us. So international relations theory, at its core, as I suggest, is about making sense of a complex world. Theory is a systematic reflection on phenomenon, designed to explain them and to show how they are related in a meaningful, intelligent pattern instead of being merely random items in an incoherent universe. A way of making the world more intelligible or better understood by going beyond mere description of the phenomenon observed and actually engaging in a causal explanation. So, looking about you in the world today and seeing a phenomenon, seeing a manifestation in the political arena, and not just understanding the phenomenon, not just understanding the manifestation, but going deeper and engaging in a causal explanation. What caused that phenomenon? Why did that manifestation occur? What does it mean for me today and for the world and the global community? And so using international relations theory gives us a sense of what dimensions of international interaction are worthy of our attention. It gives us a sense of what actors are most likely to shape events and outcomes. It makes claims about the character of international interaction and enables us to analyze, predict, and take action amidst uncertainty and complexity. As I hinted a moment ago, there is a major split in the theories of international relations that is related to ontology and epistemology. We remember that ontology describes the understanding of reality, whereas epistemology understands the nature of human knowledge and inquiry. And so the split then with positivism is a split between ontology and post-positivism epistemology. How so? In positivism, then, there is an objective reality that is relatively obvious and can be accurately known and measured. Theory exists to develop hypotheses which can then be analyzed and tested through data collection. And positivism, as we're going to see, is the dominant framework in international relations. And so, as I'm going to suggest, positivism can be related to realism or liberalism or Marxism or feminism or constructivism, but post-positivism, right, this epistemological understanding is skeptical that there is any knowledge which is objective. So remember, positivism opened with, there is an objective reality that is relatively obvious. You look up and the sky is blue, right? That is an objective reality. Well, post-positivists are skeptical that there is any knowledge which is objective. How do you know that is blue? Right? How do we know that the sky is blue? How do we have that shared assumption? Well, this is the post-positivist epistemological understanding. All events are subject to interpretation and bias. So our personal interpretation, me, Mike Crawley, the human being looking at the sky, seeing that it's blue, is my interpretation. Maybe I want it to be blue. Right? Is that my bias? Maybe it's really green and I'm just insisting it's blue because I've always been told that is blue. You get the idea. All right. So all events are subject to interpretation and bias. Now, I'm being blithe talking about the color of the sky. What about COVID-19? What about international trade wars? What about militarism and the rise of populism? What about the rise of nationalism? If we're looking at these things and we're saying in a positivist way, this is an objective reality, well, the post-positivist epistemological response is, oh yeah? Why? How so? That event, that COVID-19, that trade war, that failure of diplomatic relations is subject to interpretation and bias. So, our attempts to understand these phenomenon are really never outside the realm of values and interpretation and bias. And so they are always a reflection then of power and social conditioning. The purpose of theory and all scholarly inquiry is to expose and denaturalize these biases. And we're going to see that this post-positivist view is most notable in feminist, Marxist, and constructivist theories. So, as we continue with liberalism and realism, in feminism, Marxism, and constructivism, please bear in mind, in the back of your mind, that little bird chirping at your shoulder saying positivist and post-positivist, right? This interpretation of reality. All right, very good. The study of international relations involves theoretical approaches based on solid evidence. Theories of international relations are essentially a set of ideas aimed at explaining how the international system works. And so theories of international relations really specify the conditions under which relationships between two or more factors exist and explains the reasons for such linkages. As political scientist Bruce Gendelson explains, theory deepens understanding of patterns of causality within any particular case by penetrating beyond the situational and the particularistic to get at factors with broader applicability. So getting beyond what appears on the surface to be objective reality and getting down to brass tacks, getting down to the particular cause and penetrating beyond the situational, penetrating beyond what appears on the surface and getting down to the reality, to the core reality. This is the purpose of theory. Choosing which theory to use is also an important task because each one rests on different assumptions about the nature of international politics, and each one advances different claims about causes, and each one offers a different set of foreign policy recommendations. Now, this is going to be important, especially if we're in the foreign policy making milieu. If you are in the Department of State, if you are in the executive branch, if you are in the foreign affairs policy making, is going to be determined on how you perceive reality. How you perceive reality is going to be based on which theory you are using. Whether you're using liberalism or realism or constructivism, it's going to drive a very different response. So this is an important consideration. We're not just asking how many angels can dance on the head of a pin when it comes to theory. Theory and perspectives and therein philosophy are very important to the actual formation of foreign policy and affect our world today. Indeed, really, the menu of theories from which to choose is pretty large. Rival theories of world politics abound. There is no agreement about which one is most useful. The reason is primarily that the world is constantly changing, and no single theory has proven capable of making international events understandable for every global circumstances. So there are fads and fashions in the popularity of international theories. They rise and fall over time in popularity and perceived usefulness, depending on the global conditions that prevail in any historical period. Well, so that being said, the history of the world is a history of changes, right? In the theoretical interpretation of international relations. In any given era, a paradigm or a dominant way of looking at a particular subject, such as international relations, influences judgments regarding which characteristics of the subject are the most important, what puzzles need to be solved, and what analytical criteria should govern investigation. Over time, these perspectives then change, they evolve, and they grow. And so they are modified or abandoned as their assertions fail to mirror the prevailing patterns of international behavior. These paradigms, or these fundamental approaches scholars make about the world they are studying, tend eventually to be revised in order to explain new developments. Although we'll go into much greater detail in a moment, I want to provide you with a quick introduction to the two major theories of international relations. These are realism and liberalism. So, realism. Realism focuses on the notion that states work to increase their own power relative to other states. The theory of realism states that the only certainty in the world is power. Therefore, a powerful state, via perhaps a powerful military, the most important and the most reliable form of power, will always be able to outlast its weaker competitors. Self-preservation is a major theme in realism, as states must always seek power then to protect themselves. In realism, the international system drives states to use military force. Though leaders may be moral, they must not let morality guide their foreign policy. Furthermore, realism recognizes that international organizations in law that are so important in liberalism, or in idealism as it's also known, actually has no power and no force. And so their existence relies solely on being recognized and accepted by select states. So realism's view to liberalism is that's nice, but it's not realistic. It's not pragmatic. It's not what actually is in the state. And so just very quickly, we harken back to last week's lecture when I talked about Niccolo Machiavelli, right, and Cardinal Richelieu, and German Otto von Bismarck, right, and Machiavelli with his work The Prince, talking about the state being the end of all things and everything relying on that the state is everything and everything else is relative to the state. We talked about Cardinal Richelieu and raison d'etat, that the state and the reason of state is all that you need, that the end justifies the means. To keep the state safe is all you need to know. And Otto von Bismarck with Realpolitik, remember, right? Saying that, whatever you need to do to make the state successful, to make the state powerful, to make the state survive is okay, even if that means compromise. So these, my friends, are all realism. They're evidence of realism. They're manifestation of realism. So that's one perspective, realism, right? Liberalism is also known as idealism. And so liberalism recognizes that states share broad ties, that thus making it difficult to define any singular independent national interest. If we're all together in this, if we're all sharing the world, then what is a definitive singular independent national interest? There is no such thing. We're all intercombined. We're all interrelated. That what we do in the United States is going to affect Canada and Mexico and Costa Rica and the Virgin Islands. We're all connected. And so this is liberalism. This is idealism. So liberal approaches to the study of international relations, also referred to as theories of complex interdependence, claim that the consequences of military power outweigh the benefits, and that international cooperation is in the interest of every state. It also claims that exercising economic power over military power has proven more effective. Which brings us back to a couple of points from last week's lecture. Just in case you thought that 4.5-hour lecture was just to torture you, there was actually reason to go into all those elements, right? And so if you're looking at the United States post-World War II, I talked about the Marshall Plan. I talked about the Truman Doctrine. I talked about the advent of the Cold War, the Bay of Pigs, the Cuban Missile Crisis, Vietnam, Korea. All these things then are going to speak to our interconnectedness as a world, our interconnectedness as nations among other nations, the rise of the European Union, the rise of trade agreements. These are all liberal, what they call Washington Consensus bodies that are going to further public policy based on the interpretation of international relations and foreign affairs with an eye toward liberalism. Liberalism as a guiding function. Although the liberal theory of international relations was dominant following World War I, while President Woodrow Wilson promoted the League of Nations and many treaties abolishing war, realism came back into prominence in the Second World War and then continued through the Cold War. For those of you who are interested, these theories are addressed in much greater depth, both in my comparative ideologies class and in my international political economy class, both of which are available free via YouTube online. Please check out my channel's playlists for access to those lectures. Many of these ideas and conversations are developed much more fully, both from a comparative ideology and from a strictly political economy standpoint. So it's the same perspectives. It's the same philosophies, but looking at different aspects of international relations. And please don't worry, I'm not making any money off this. I have no payback mechanism with YouTube. I do these freely. Their intention is to promote information and to promote understanding, and not to drive home any polemical argument on my point. So, professionals studying international relations often determine the level at which they will analyze a state's behavior, whether it's system, state, organization, or individual. This is the subject of our next week lecture, so I won't go too deeply into addressing them here. But I do need to at least introduce you to them so that you can become familiar with the terms and to understand from the start that perspectives and levels of analysis are relative to each other. Although addressed in separate chapters of our textbook, and subsequently, I agree with our textbook author, it'll be separated out in our lectures, suffice it for today to know that they are interrelated, that the perspectives and levels of analysis are interrelated, that one makes sense of the other. So next week's lecture will be almost the second half of this week's lecture. But suffice it for today to know that there really are 4 levels of analysis in examining behavior. There is first the system level analysis. So system level analysis looks at the international system. More specifically, how the international system affects the behavior of nation states, with the key variable being that the international system includes the power of each state rather than being independent of them. Okay, the second level of analysis is the state level analysis. State level analysis examines how a state's characteristics determine its foreign policy behavior. The type of analysis often views states as having cultural characteristics based on their social traditions and, their historical legacy, and it includes an analysis of economic and geographic factors. And so if you're looking at how a state acts, you can look at it both as a liberal or as a realist or as a Marxist, feminist, or constructivist, but always bearing in mind that a state-level analysis looks at the state specifically and how the state's cultural characteristics, religious and social traditions, historical legacy, their economy and their geography all tend to influence, even more so, those perspectives. So level of analysis influencing theoretical perspectives as well. You have an organizational level of analysis. So this examines how organizations within a state influence the state's foreign policy behavior. In other words, an organization level analysis views that organizations, not the states themselves, make the decisions that create a state's foreign policy. Now, again, I'm going to talk about this ad nauseum next week, so I don't want to go into greater detail here, but the organizational level analysis is founded in the idea of pluralist theory. Pluralist theory, if you've taken my American government class or if you're interested in it, suggests that it's large groups and not the government that actually creates policy in our nation, that this is a state level of analysis looking at our organizational level analysis. Finally, we have the individual level analysis, where it views how leaders of the states are the largest influencers of foreign policy. And again, please remember, these are all interrelated. And so if you're looking at the organizational level analysis and the state level analysis and the system level analysis, if you're looking at perhaps the United States is reacting to the trade war with China, each one of these levels of analysis, with both a realist and liberal perspective, all will help get at the causes of what the trade war is and what it means. So the trade war with China is the manifestation. That is what we see on the front page. These perspectives, these theoretical perspectives, and these levels of analysis help us get at the heart of what's behind that trade war. Is it realist? Is it liberal? Is it system? Is it state? Is it organizational? Is it an individual? Is it Marxist? Is it feminist? What the heck is going on? And again, These are just tools, really tools to help us understand what it is that we're seeing in the papers. All right, you guys are getting it. But we'll touch more on the levels of state behavior, as I said, next week. And it's going to be a wonderful lecture that's actually going to juxtapose it to globalism as well. So again, going back to our core foundations, international relations then is the study of interactions, right, between state and non-state actors in the world. Realism, then, as I've said, is one of the major theories attempting to explain this relations among the states. Political realism seeks to explain international relations between states in terms of power, right? Power is basically the capability to make another state do something it would not otherwise do, or to stop it from doing something that it wants to do. A quick example. Well, let's say you're the leader of a small country, right, surrounded by some bigger unfriendly states that all like your territory's natural resources, right? They want your gold, they want your titanium, whatever the case may be. They want your oil. Fortunately, you have an alliance with a neighbor that is also big and strong, right? And so that together you are greater than the people who want your natural resources. And by your alliance, then, you can prevent them from invading your country. Well, of course, there's no such thing as a free lunch, right? And your ally, then, is going to expect something from you, right? They're not allying with you to keep you safe just out of being nice, right? They want something for that as well. So your ally expects you to, let's say, open your domestic markets to their imports, free of any tariffs or free of any trade barriers. Realism, then, is all about this pragmatic compromise, right? Which is why I kept going back to Otto von Bismarck and Realpolitik, because Realpolitik was all about pragmatic compromise, and that's at heart realism. So what makes a state powerful, remember, is the capability of influencing another state. In the world of states, this capability is based on both tangible and intangible characteristics. A state's tangible characteristics include such things as size, geography, natural resources, economic power, military power. What about technological development or sheer number of population, right? Intangible characteristics include such things as the national will, right? Or the popular support for the government, or an ideology, or the lack of support for your government. So we see that military power is one, but it is not the only avenue to power on the world stage. We understand that realism is the oldest of the prevailing schools of thought and has a long and distinguished history dating back to the Greek Empire and the Peloponnesian War in ancient Greece. Other influential figures who contributed to realist thought include, oh, that's right, Niccolo Machiavelli and 17th century philosopher Thomas Hobbes. We haven't talked much about Hobbes yet. We'll talk about him more and at great length in this class. Hobbes wrote a book called Leviathan, and Leviathan speaks to realist perspective in the need for a strong central authority. Right? Realism, then, deserves careful examination by us today because its worldview continues to guide much of our understanding of world politics. And as I'm going to suggest, realism goes hand in hand with populism and nationalism. So realism, as applied to contemporary international politics, views the state as the most important actor on the world stage because it answers to no higher political authority. States are sovereign. They have supreme power over their territory and populace, and no other actor stands above them to wield legitimacy and coercive capability and to govern the global system. Emphasizing the absence of a higher authority to which states can turn for protection and to resolve disputes, realists depict world politics as a ceaseless, repetitive struggle for power, where the strong dominate the weak. Because each state is ultimately responsible for its own survival and feels uncertain about its neighbors' intentions, realism claims that prudent political leaders build strong armies and alliances to enhance national security. In other words, international anarchy leads even well-intended leaders to practice self-help, to increase their own military strength and opportunistically align with others to deter political enemies. Well, but then realist theory does not preclude the possibility that rival powers will cooperate on arms control, let's say, or on other security issues out of a common interest. Rather, it simply asserts that cooperation will be rare because states worry about the unequal distribution of relative gains, or a zero-sum game. Leaders should never entrust the lack of self-protection to an international security organization or even to international law, and should resist efforts to regulate international behavior through global governance. But there are critics of realism. A growing number of critics point out that realism does not account for significant new developments in world politics. For instance, realism could not explain the creation of new commercial and political institutions in Western Europe in the 1950s and 1960s, where the cooperative pursuit of mutual advantage led Europeans away from unbridled power politics that had brought them incessant warfare since the birth of the nation-state some 3 centuries earlier. Other critics begin to worry about realism's tendency to disregard ethical principles and the material and social costs some of its policy prescriptions imposed, such as hindered economic growth resulting from unrestrained military expenditures. Well, despite realism's shortcomings, many people continue to think about world politics in the language constructed by realists, especially in times of global tension. So this can be seen in Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's declaration in March of 2013 that Israel had both the right and the capability to defend itself, while placing greater emphasis on military security and national interest. His statement comes amid speculation about the possibility of unilateral Israeli military strikes in response to tensions in the region. Realism as a perspective of international relations depends on the idea of the state is the end. Anything we need to do to keep the state safe is fine. And that includes military hard power or economic soft power. Which brings us to our examination then of liberalism. As Charles Kegley points out in his wonderful book, World Politics, Trend and Transformation, liberalism has been called the strongest contemporary challenge to realism. Like realism, it has a distinguished pedigree, with philosophical roots extending back to the political thought of John Locke, Immanuel Kant, Adam Smith. Liberalism warrants our attention because it speaks to issues realism disregards, including the impact of domestic politics on state behavior, the implications of economic interdependence, and the role of global norms and institutions in promoting international cooperation. So this calls to mind then a quick caveat, which is the difference then between using the term liberal or liberalism in its correct context as opposed to liberal in its relation to conservatism. Okay, what do I mean by that? We often use the terms liberal and conservative hand in hand, right? That one is counter to the other. Well, I think, and I hope you'll agree with me, that a more appropriate term to use would be conservative and progressive. So here's how. A conservative by nature seeks to conserve or to slow the rate of change, right? And perfectly reasonable political philosophy. Conservatism is great. It's definitely one of the elements that we need in a vibrant democracy. We need conservatives. We also need progressives. Progressives, then, are people who seek to change, who seek to forward civil liberties, who seek to forward civil rights, and to expand democracy, to expand the franchise. Those would be progressives. A good example would be the progressive era reforms of the early 1900s, such things as giving women the right to vote, having senators popularly elected as opposed to elected by the state legislatures. These are progressive era reforms. Progressive era because they sought to expand franchise. They sought to expand democracy. Well, and again, this is juxtaposed to conservative. So conservative and progressive. Therefore, it leaves us liberalism, and the term liberalism, to its more correct meaning, which is that theory, that philosophical school of the Age of Enlightenment, the Age of Enlightenment being in the late 1700s and the early 1800s. I'm thinking the American Revolution, I'm thinking the French Revolution, I'm thinking the early 1800s, especially in England, where you have a school of thought that is called Age of Enlightenment philosophy. They are referring to liberals. Now, liberalism in this sense can also be related to economic philosophy, and we're going to be touching on Adam Smith in his book The Wealth of Nations a lot. He is actually an economic liberalist, and so we'll be talking about his voice in regards to mercantilism as a reflection, an economic reflection of realism, whereas free trade is more a reflection of liberal Age of Enlightenment ideologies. All right, very good. So there are several distinct schools of thought within the liberal tradition, and drawing broad conclusions from a diverse body of theory might run the risk of misinterpreting the position of any single author. Nevertheless, there is sufficient commonality to abstract some general themes in liberalism, in this liberalism worldview. Liberals, my friends, differ from realists in several important ways. At the core of liberalism is a belief in reason and in the possibility of progress. Liberals often view the individual as the seat of moral value and assert that human beings should be treated as ends rather than as means. Whereas realists counsel decision makers to seek the lesser evil rather than the absolute good, liberals emphasize ethical principle over the pursuit of power and institutions over military capabilities. And so if we're looking at evidence of liberalism in the United States and in the world stage, I would give you the Washington Consensus, which we covered last week. That was the Marshall Plan, the Truman Doctrine, and the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, these international institutions that are intended to embrace and promote international cooperation, as opposed to realism, where it's every state for itself. Follow? Okay. So then liberalism then seeks these common institutions to rise the boat for everybody, that we don't need military power as much as we need cooperation and international institutions that will help everybody. Now, remember, the realists are going to counter and say, but these international institutions have no law. They have no teeth. The World Trade Organization, the IMF, the World Bank, pshaw, right? We are Russia. We are China. We are the United States. We need pay no attention to these international bodies. Well, that's the realist perspective. And that seeks to explain how interstate relations happen in an anarchic international milieu. If there is no governing authority, no higher authority, the realists say, then it's every state for themselves. Well, the liberalists say, but we're creating this cooperative idea. We're creating these cooperative institutions whereby then states will no longer need to resort to military power. So even today, then, some studies contend that this economic interconnectedness is an even more important factor than democracy in fostering peace. The doctrine that this unfettered trade helps prevent disputes from escalating to wars rests, well, on several propositions. First, commercial intercourse creates a material incentive to resolve disputes peacefully. War reduces profits by interrupting vital economic exchanges. Second, cosmopolitan business elites, who benefit most from these exchanges, comprise a powerful transnational interest group with a stake in promoting amicable solutions to festering disagreements. Finally, the web of trade between countries increases communications, erodes national selfishness, and encourages both sides to avoid ruinous clashes. Finally, the third commonality in liberalism is that advocacy of global institutions that I've been talking about. Liberals recommend replacing cutthroat balance of power politics with organizations based on principle that a threat to peace anywhere is a common threat to everyone. They see foreign policy as unfolding in a nascent global society populated by actors who recognize the cost of conflict, share significant interests, and can realize those interests by using institutions to mediate disputes whenever misconceptions, wounded sensibilities, or aroused national passions threaten peaceful solutions. Well, realists counter again, however, that neither globalization nor international institutions impose genuine constraints on great powers simply because states have sufficient power to interpret their own sovereignty and to participate in global institutions only to the extent that it suits their own national interest. And we're going to talk about this when we look at the United States post-World War I. Despite Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, despite the League of Nations, despite this call, this liberal movement then worldwide to do away with the causes of war and to come together to build these institutions of commonality, the United States effectively took its marbles and went home. They became more isolationist. They refused to ratify the Treaty of Versailles. They refused to join the League of Nations. They created the possibility then, really, if I may, of the Second World War happening. Sad but true. So the liberal perspective then is built on cooperation. It's built on mutual trust. It's built on institutions that will help provide a level of governance at the world level to keep people in line. It subsumes national identity to economic and social interests. A good example would be the European Union. We're going to have a great lecture in about 5 or 6 weeks that really touches on the birth and the advent and the reason the European Union came about. And it's going to be a fascinating look at liberalism. So I really invite you to look forward to that as much as I. Which brings us to Marxism. The third classical concept of international relations, along with realism and liberalism, is Marxism, and its further evolution into neo-Marxism. As an IR theorist himself, Marx explained patterns of social and political development with a particular view of interstate and intersocietal relations that were fundamentally different from liberal and realist ideas. According to Marxism, politics, including international relations, is neither a struggle for power, as evidenced in realism, nor an attempt to better the world, as expressed in liberalism. Rather, Marx suggested it's a struggle for the distribution of economic resources. This economic determinism distinguishes Marxism from realism and liberalism. However, Marxism is also a classical IR theory because it provides a systemic explanation to the nature of international relations. It gives a fundamentally different but comprehensive vision of the basic theoretical elements explaining international politics and connectedness between them, including individual, state, and non-state actors, the international system, and the motives of actors and key patterns driving international relations. Marxism was really the first theory to provide one with an alternative view on history, societal relations, religion, and, well, heck, theory itself. It challenges the epistemology laid down in traditional IR perspectives, realism and neorealism, and liberal and neoliberal viewpoints. Marxism, as a theory, has a very unique destiny in the field of political science. The very essence of Marxism challenged the established norms and epistemologies engraved in our society, as well as the societal order itself. So consequently, Marxism, although arguably giving a large contribution to perspectives in international relations, was kind of predetermined to be the radical outcast across the theories in social sciences. Furthermore, its initial negative reputation has been reinforced by its association with Marxism-Leninism developed in the USSR, a stereotype that really imprisons it to this very day. So, conflating traditional, theoretical, philosophical Marxism, as found in his writings, let's say Das Kapital or the Communist Manifesto, is different from Marxism-Leninism that was established as the governing mechanism of the USSR, while Marxism-Leninism ostensibly takes its inspiration from classic theoretical philosophical Marxism. It isn't that theoretical Marxism. It is something that is different. And so to associate Marxism with Marxism-Leninism is an incorrect relation. It's an incorrect correlation. So one reason, then, Marxism provides us with an alternative view of reality is in its roots. While realism bases its understanding of reality on the tenets proposed by, that's right, Machiavelli and Hobbes, and liberalism basing its understanding of reality on the Age of Enlightenment thinking, being dependent on international cooperation, Marxist thought is a result of Marx's careful analysis of Hegel's master-slave dialect. Okay. George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, who lived from 1770 to 1831, explored the relentless struggle within the human consciousness, and he called this the master-slave dialect. Well, Marx, interpreting Hegel, diverted from that philosophic route into a political route. In other words, he took Hegel's idea and applied it to politics. And then he saw the dialect of master-slave as the manifestation of the struggle between the social classes rather than between the human consciousness, which is what Hegel had been talking about. So, in his view, after the concepts of bondage and lordship were applied to the system of social classes, it appears that individuals in a social system were bound with an obligation to recognize their bondage to one another. So the deviant Hegelian, right, Hegelian, the deviant Hegelian philosophy outlined became the basis for Marx's logical discussion of ideas leading to his material concept of history. This Marxian concept suggests that history is the result of material conditions rather than ideals, which is why we often call Marxism structuralism, especially when we apply Marxism to economic philosophy. We're going to be talking about the structure of the society actually creating the society, creating the interaction between states, and not some discussion of ideas. It's actually going to be the structure and not the ideas. So again, this deviant Hegelian philosophy outlined, this master-slave paradigm, did become the basis for Marx's logical discussions of ideas, leading to his concept of material history. The Marxian concept suggests that history is the result of material conditions rather than ideals. The differentiation of Marx and Hegel's ideas lies in their differing view on the outcome of the conversation. Okay, unlike Hegel, Marx does not see the master-slave relationship as a continuous spiral, an ongoing thing, but rather a route to a barrier that will be overcome with a necessary critical mass, when a necessary critical mass is accumulated, with the conquest resulting in a revolution towards evolution. So in other words, Hegel said this master-slave dynamic is just going to be going on and self-perpetuating into eternity. Marx says, no. It's going to come to a point where there is a critical mass, and the conquest of the proletariat against the bourgeois then will result in revolution, and that will result in evolution, stepping beyond this historical paradigm. And so the possibility of conquering this abstract barrier is, in my view, the most important aspect that distinguishes Marxism from the theories of realism and liberalism and other mainstream theories that bind one to an existence in a world guided by generally accepted and timeless rules that are never questioned. The possibility of evolution is Marxism's main contribution to international relations. The ability of Marxism to look outside the box, to question our existence and not only provide an alternative route, but more importantly, to allow for the possibility of change in the status quo, is what makes it an attractive alternative for further exploration into the conditions of the contemporary world. So, my friends, I've been beating you senseless with Marxism, but there's a method to my madness. Bear with me. There are three fundamentals of Marxism. First, Marx says the world should be analyzed as a totality. The world cannot be segregated into separate disciplines, or to be more exact, one cannot understand the world based on his opinion of just one of these disciplines. All disciplines need to be taken into account, whether it's economics and history and political science and socialism and feminism, whatever the case may be, all disciplines need to be brought to bear in order to understand the world. Check. The main second idea with Marx, as mentioned above, is this materialist conception of history. Social change as the reflection of the level of development of society. Marx outlines the tension between the means of production and the relations of production. In other words, the haves and the have-nots, the capitalists versus the proletariat, the bourgeois versus the proletariat, the lords versus the serfs, right? This materialist conception of history needs to change. The social change then is going to come about, says Marx, through revolution. And so we're going to be applying this, bear with me, to aspects of international relations. When we see the Syrian civil war, we can look at it through a realist, we can look at it through a liberal viewpoint, or we can look at it through a Marxist perspective, saying, oh, that's right, the proletariat are going to rise up. And what does that look like in international relations? Well, the third point, very shortly, in essence, is that Marxism, unlike realism, sees change as a possibility. Well, achieved through revolution, but change is a possibility. Realism suggests that this is always going to be the status quo. This is always going to be the state of nature. Well, Marx disagrees. Another challenging alternative approach of rationalism and constructivism. Rationalism is the philosophic view that regards reason as the chief source and test of knowledge. A rationalist uses logic as the chief principle in knowledge. This means that everything we learn, and we use reason in every situation above all else. Our reason also ultimately provides justification for our morals and our beliefs. We are rational. Reason, rationality, dictates how we see and view certain situations, and our opinion of right and wrong toward the situation is driven by that rationalism. So the guiding principles of social constructivism are that knowledge is constructed through human activity, and individuals create meaning of their actions through their interactions. So, before we grapple with the constructivist approach, it is worth noting something. It is worth noting something distinctive about the discipline of political science. Different disciplines define and organize themselves in different ways. For example, historians define themselves as those who adhere to a particular methodology for the construction of a narrative, to wit, historiography. As chroniclers, they document the progression of events and lower the barriers to understanding that progression. As social scientists, they may attempt to uncover causal relationships. Within the discipline, they tend to arrange themselves based on the distinctions of geographic and temporal space, or the time frame. For example, Tudor England, or the American Revolution. So with historians, they are meant to be competent to discuss all the big issues within the context of their chosen time and space. So if you're looking at Tudor England or the American Revolution, it's inherent that you will be competent to discuss gender in Tudor England, and politics in the American Revolution, culture, society, science, the economy, and religion. Economists define themselves according to a specific approach, which is either positive and normative, as well as specific framework, i.e. micro or macroeconomics, and the methodology they use, be it statistics, hypothesis formulation and testing, etc. In general, economists attempt to explain how individuals maximize their preferences given environmental constraints. Economists utilize their same kit of tools to explain everything from dental hygiene to nuclear war. Political scientists, oh, we few, we happy few. Political science is defined rather differently from the disciplines of history and economics. Political science is a discipline defined by its substantive concern, that is, politics, rather than its approach or its methodology. And so if in history you have an approach, historiography, if in economics you have a methodology, in political science we're defined by our substantive concern, that is, politics. So to be a political scientist, one must study political economy, conflict, organization, culture, process, behavior, and theory. And so, insofar as approach, there are numerous theories: game theory, historical narrative, use of statistics, use of case studies, interviews, surveys, rational choice mechanics, structural and symbolic interaction, etc. In other words, there is no single distinctive scientific approach that political scientists use to perform their studies. We use it all. So this may feel a bit schizophrenic. A critic might say this makes political science fractured. It doesn't have the cohesiveness, then, of the methodology of history, right, or of the approaches of economics. It feels scattered. It feels fractured. So while this diversity may inspire constant conflict, it also brings the benefits of intellectual cross-fertilization. So rationalism and constructivism, in fact, are the products of this kind of intellectual cross-fertilization. Rationalism and constructivism as an approach, a perspective of studying international political economy, along with classic liberalism, mercantilism, and structuralism, is just one more way of trying to get at the question. And so rationalism and constructivism tries to broaden the net, tries to broaden the approach, the search, and broaden the questions being asked. So again, going back to the norms and the conventions to get at the heart of a political tradition, and how then that political tradition establishes itself in the life of the nation. So going back again then to these rationalists, rationalists explain how actors maximize their goals given various constraints. But they pay little attention to the source of those actors' goals. Instead, these preferences are treated exogeneously determined as outside the political process. And so again, then these rationalists explain how actors maximize their goals given various constraints. But they pay little attention to the source of these actors' goals. Instead, these preferences are treated as exogeneously determined, as outside the political process. So exogenously means outside of or external factor. So an external factor determining the political process. And so looking at the approaches then in rationalism, we understand that autonomous actors, such as states, policymakers, possess exogenously from external factors determined interests. These actors attempt to maximize their preferences in a constrained environment, specifically an anarchic environment, as in mercantilism's cry of no world police. And so these actors attempt to maximize their preferences in a constrained environment, specifically this anarchic environment, this free-for-all. So in the rationalist approach, then, is the sum total of the actors' attempts to maximize their preferences given these constraints. These theorists all think about the states in the international system in the same way that economists think about actors in the market. They all employ the economist's rational choice approach. Thus they are sometimes called rationalists. But then we also have constructivists. Constructivists utilize a different approach and pursue different questions. Constructivists want to ask, how are these actors' all-important preferences formed in the first place? They want to endogenize several of the elements that rationalists treat as exogenously determined. In other words, coming from within instead of from without. So instead of looking at the United Kingdom as a political economic expression in the world stage from a rationalist approach, how does the UK manifest its political economic policy by virtue of its internally formed, its internally revealed elements? And so this goes to the heart of identity and interest formation. So how then do constructivists study and understand where identities and interests come from? So hopefully you'll see there's a method to my madness, guys. In constructivism, institutions are important. And we're looking at the UK and these institutions in an unwritten constitution that are inherently based on norms and conventions instead of on a written constitution. These institutions are all important in constructivism. Sovereignty is changing and is influenced both by state and non-state actors. Constructivists look at the social content of international organizations, norms that govern behavior and shape interests, and decipher how these interests influence actors. In constructivism, they believe that international organizations can serve as agents of social construction. IGOs, international governmental organizations, have the potential to be major actors with independent effects on international relations. Transnational networks of experts change or shape understanding of more and more collective issues. As with rationalists, there are approaches in the constructivist philosophy. While economists may best explain how actors maximize their preferences, sociologists have the most to say about how actors' preferences actually develop in the first place. Constructivists understand identities and interests to be the product of processes rather than structure, such as the idea of political socialization, or how we gain our understanding of our political world and our relationship to it. In other words, there is a discourse analysis, or an analysis of how the conversation happens, how the discourse happens, how we create our political identity. So, in the constructivist approach, they argue that it is through reciprocal interaction. In other words, that we create the relatively enduring social structures in terms of which we define our identities and interests. So let me do that again, just so that we're clear. It is through reciprocal interaction, how we relate to one another through enduring social structures, that we define our identities and our interests. So again, if we're looking at the UK from a constructivist approach, if you're looking at the social structures and the political structures, they're going to define the identities and the interests of the individuals. We said in classic liberalism that it is the individual that informs the political discourse. The constructivist approach is putting that on its head, saying that it is the social structures that define our identities and our interests. Check? Which sounds more like what we learned in the structuralist perspective. And so we understand that constructivism and rationalism are simply approaches, right? They're perspectives. And scholars identify constructivism and rationalism as approaches rather than individual theories or even a school of theories. As approaches, they simply provide an understanding of what there is to study, the ontology, and how we study it, the epistemology. But the two approaches differ significantly along several dimensions. So remember, ontology is what is there to study. Epistemology is how to study it. With the rationalist ontology, we look at interstate interactions, we look at the outcome, we look at the state's interests, we look at the international environment, we look at the strategies for maximizing interests, and we look at the building blocks of what the system is. So again, interstate interactions, the outcome, the results, the state's interests, the international environment, the strategies for maximizing the state's interests, and the building blocks that we're dealing with. That is what we're going to study. That is the rationalist ontology. The rationalist epistemology, or how to study, is borrowed from economics. So states are assumed to enjoy bounded rationality, right? That they can make rational decisions, that they are rational in their core, at their base. States attempt then to use strategies, rational strategies, to maximize their preferences given their constraints. So different theories specify different values for these building blocks. In the constructivist ontology, what to study, we're looking at interstate interactions. We look at the determinative process. We look at state interests. We look at the international environment. And again, strategies for maximizing interests and the products or the outcome of the process. In the constructivist epistemology, we borrow more from sociology. Remember, the rationalists were borrowing from economics. The constructivists are borrowing from sociology. In other words, they're looking at the structure, the interests, the environment, and the strategies, and that these cannot be understood apart from the process or the international interaction. States construct these elements through their interactions. And so, what is the key difference? In rationalism, structure is independent of process. In constructivism, structure is dependent on process. To what extent does structure depend on process insofar as interstate interactions, state interests, strategies for maximizing interests, and the international environment go? Which brings us then to the next of our less than standard approaches, right? We've touched on realism, liberalism, Marxism, constructivism, and now this last perspective in international relations, feminism. And for me, this is one of the most exciting, one of the most interesting, one of the most thought-provoking perspectives. I love to delve into this, and I would really look forward to it if people chose feminism as one of their perspectives to apply to the seminar question. I would just really love that, because I would learn so much from your understanding and your analysis of it. From my vantage point, I think it's safe to say that feminist theory looks at international relations through the lens of gender and equality. Feminists examine gender stereotypes in international relations, and in particular, how some assume that power is a male characteristic. Feminist theorists look at how these sorts of stereotypes affect actors in the international system. A marvelous website, internationalrelations.org, tells us that traditionally, many of the international theories centered on examining state relations with one another, particularly with an emphasis on war and trade. Check. Furthermore, feminist theories have long argued that international relations has primarily been one of patriarchy. Feminist theory says that most of the key players in IR, such as diplomats, policymakers, heads of government, and academic professionals have been, and still are, males who come from a patriarchal, social, and political background. However, in recent years, and arguably since the end of the Cold War, there has been increased shift from only relying on a limited number of theories for explaining events in the international system. For example, in recent decades, there has been more attention to issues of human security as opposed to more traditional approaches to only examining security from the perspective of the state. This is great because this is exactly what we're going to be talking about in Chapter 11. Framed in its own set of binary distinctions, the discipline of international relations assumes similarly hierarchical relationships when it posits an anarchic world outside to be defended against through the accumulation of rational use of power. In political discourse, this becomes translated into stereotypical notions about those who inhabit the outside. Like women, foreigners are frequently portrayed as the other. Non-whites and tropical countries are often depicted as irrational, emotional, and unstable, characteristics that are also attributed to women. The construction of this discourse and the way in which we are taught to think about international politics closely parallel the way in which we are socialized into understanding gender differences. To ignore these hierarchical constructions and their relevance to power is therefore to risk perpetuating these relationships of domination and subordination. Feminist examinations of international relations are important, and they challenge traditional ways that we look at core international relations, such as power, security, economics, and trade, while the more historical theories of realism and liberalism tend to get much of the attention with regards to explaining the relations within the world we live in. Feminism in international relations has attempted to provide a new, yet equally important voice to these issues. Sadly, there are many who have felt that feminist international relations has tended to flourish as a subfield of the main field of international relations, really without much impact on the field as a whole. Well, I'm hoping that we're going to change that today. I'm hoping that we're going to really take feminist theory at its core and apply it along with realism and liberalism and Marxism and constructivism to understanding international relations. My friends, the theory of feminism in international relations has departed from realism and liberalism in different ways. Feminism has challenged traditional realist views of power and the implications of power in this anarchical world that we've talked about. In fact, this is a major point of division between feminism in international relations and realism in international relations. In fact, much feminist IR theory stems from a critique of realism, whose socially constructed worldview continues to guide much thought about world politics. First, feminists argue that realists overvalue the role of the state in defining international relations without really questioning how the state itself is internally structured politically and socially. And that's what's going to get us to the levels of analysis next week. Check. Feminist theory will consider how the state includes or excludes the views of its individual citizens and how, in turn, the state's domestic views translate into foreign policy. In relation to realism, feminist theory is clear. Realism is the antithesis to achieving gender equality, both in discussion and practice, and even in its tools of war and security. Patriarchy remains the central theme. States are the actors, and the individual is of little importance. When the individual is de-emphasized, there is even less acknowledgement of a female individual, which effectively excludes feminist discussion. Feminist international relations has identified international relations theory as one of the discourses that help perpetuate a distorted and partial worldview that reflects the disproportionate power of control and influence that men hold, rather than the full social reality that includes the lives of women, children, and men. Much of this can be seen with the approach to the notions of security. Traditional attention to security has revolved around the state as the primary actor. Well, within international relations, discussions of international security traditionally revolve around the issues of war and peace in an international system of sovereign and self-interested nation-states, with a particular focus on issues of military strategy. In this view, the provision of security is entrusted to the state, with the assumption that states protect and secure the members of the political community from threats emanating from the dangerous foreign realm outside state borders. But feminists and other scholars have taken issue with this understanding of security. For them, the idea of security is security for the individual, who happens to be the one most affected by things such as war and conflict. This approach to human security, and not merely state security, has allowed us to ask questions not only about humans who are affected by war, conflict, famine, the failure of diplomacy, but feminist theory also asks how we can further examine gender and how it's approached in the world. Thus, this feminist theory is more reflective and expressive of historically established male power that is an open and comprehensive exploration of the political and economic processes in which all members of society are engaged. It is more of a discourse of and about the powerful than one that seeks to examine deeply how power works, including its gendered, radicalized, and socio-economic dimensions, or to situation individuals and groups differently in terms of contrasting levels of capacity, control, influence, and freedom. Thus, to feminist theory in international relations, even the non-realist schools of thought in IR that are more open to looking at the non-state actor, such as liberalism, still fall short of providing full rights of equality for women. For example, looking at the issue of liberalism, one finds that the theory's concentration on free trade as a mechanism for cooperation and interdependence may have different effects for men as it does for women. While trade and economic growth is good, there are questions about whether women receive the same benefits of this trade openness and whether they are discriminated against where the economic inequalities inherent to free trade disproportionately affect women. Well, there is attention to questions surrounding gender and also patriarchy in international relations. How are women, and how is gender in particular, viewed? Are there biases against women in human rights, in conflict, in diplomacy, and any other related issues within international relations? How have women been excluded from international relations and politics? Feminism in international relations argues that there are many examples of how women are either disregarded or discriminated against politically and in international relations. A feminist international relations perspective may look at how the vast majority of countries have a male as head of state, even though women make up over half the world's population. Feminism in international relations may also examine why so few women hold top posts in international organizations. Or take the issue of running for political office. Feminist theories argue that women are often held to a very different standard than men when running for office. Men are rarely asked questions about their emotions, and also about how they look. yet women have to be scrutinized in ways that men are not. Well, it's theorists within feminist international relations also examine how others might interact with women leaders compared to male leaders. Related to this, how are women treated when in power? When Bella Asbjørg entered the House of Representatives in 1972, she claimed that ending the war in Vietnam was the most important item on the congressional agenda and the one on which she wanted most to work as the representative of the many women and men in her district who opposed the war. With this goal in mind, Asbjørg requested a seat on the House Armed Services Committee, a committee on which, in 1972, no woman had served in the past 22 years. Bella's request was denied by members of the House leadership, one of whom suggested that the Agriculture Committee would be more appropriate. In her account of the incident, Asbjørg notes, of the 12 women in the House of Representatives in 1972, 5 were assigned to the Education and Labor Committee, evidence that suggests that women in politics are channeled into certain arenas of public policy that are perceived as women's issues. It is these sorts of gender discrimination that feminist theories examine in international relations. Well, with regards to human rights in IR, feminism examines the way women's human rights are violated, whether it is not receiving equal education or employment opportunities, not having an equal vote in civil society, or in decision-making processes within a country, or how women's rights are violated in the context of war and also in everyday life. Feminists argue the topic of security should address acts of rape and violence, not only from foreign perpetrators, but from their own fellow citizens as well. Feminists would also add that occurrences of rape increases during times of war and is even used as a method of ethnic cleansing among the rivalries within their states. Yet that would never enter into a typical IR discussion that focuses solely on state-to-state interaction, simply because IR discussions traditionally remain focused on states as the key actors. Thus, it is imperative that we break out of this idea that the only type of security that matters is state security. Once we accept the importance of human security in international relations, we can further understand issues of gender within the field of IR. And so feminist theory, much like constructivism, much like Marxism, tends to raise another question, another set of questions, especially around levels of analysis that we're going to touch on next week, about how and why we look at contemporary manifestations of international relations, how we get to the causes of international relations conflict. Oh, my friends, thank you for your forbearance. So we come now to our conclusion and to our reiteration of the seminar question. So to understand our changing world and to make reasonable prognosis about the future, we must begin by arming ourselves, right, with an array of information and these conceptual tools to entertain rival interpretations of world politics in the global marketplace of ideas and to question the assumptions on which these contending worldviews rest. Because there are a great and growing number of alternative and sometimes incompatible ways of organizing theoretical inquiry about world politics, the challenge of capturing the world's political problems cannot be reduced to any one simple yet compelling account. Each paradigmatic effort to do so in the past has ultimately lost advocates as developments in world affairs eroded its continuing relevance. So, as you seek to understand changing global conditions, it is important, I would suggest, to be humble in recognizing the limitations of our understandings of world politics and, at the same time, inquisitive about its character. The task of interpretation is complicated because the world is complicated. My friends, all theories are maps of possible futures, right? Theories can guide us in fitting the pieces together to form an accurate picture. However, in evaluating the usefulness of any theory to interpret global conditions, the historical overview in this lecture suggests that it would be wrong to oversimplify or to assume that any one particular theory is the end-all and the answer to all. Although realism, liberalism, constructivism are the dominant ways of thinking about world politics today, none of these theories is completely satisfactory. Recall that realism is frequently criticized for relying on ambiguous concepts. Liberalism is often derided for making naive policy recommendations based on idealistic assumptions. And constructivism, as I suggested, is charged with being a social scientific framework rather than a real theory. Moreover, as the challenges mounted by feminism and Marxism in their critiques suggest, these three mainstream theories overlook seemingly important aspects of world politics, which limits their explanatory power. Well, despite these setbacks, each theory does have strengths, helping us to interpret certain kinds of international events and foreign policy behaviors. So, because we lack a single overarching theory that is able to account for all facets of world politics, we will draw in future lectures on realist, liberal, and constructivist thought. Moreover, unsurprisingly, we will supplement them with the insights from feminism and the Marxist critique, where these theoretical traditions can best help to interpret the topic covered. My friends, this leads us back, as promised, to our seminar question. Remember, our seminar question for this week asks, choosing an historical era different from that which you used for our History of the Nation-State exercise, please interpret the actions of the nation-states using two comparative perspectives. And so, as I suggest, the best way to create your essay is to change the seminar question into a declarative statement, in other words, to a thesis statement. And so I gave it a crack, and what I came up with as a thesis statement was, the era of the concert of Europe seems to have elements explained by both realist and liberal perspectives. Great. And so what this does, creating a thesis statement, goes into your introduction, right? And so your introductory paragraph, paragraph 1, your thesis statement usually comes about the end, right? There's an old adage that I love using. It's Marlis Mayfield, one of my professors many, many years ago, taught this to me. But a good essay has the elements of tell them you're going to tell them, tell them, and tell them you told them. Tell them you're going to tell them, and tell them you told them. So tell them you're going to tell them is the introduction, right? Including your thesis statement. And then tell them is the body of your essay. So paragraph 2, then, remembering that your reader knows absolutely nothing of what it is that we're talking about, don't presume that your reader knows any of the definitions, would be to define your terms. So I would suggest that paragraph 2 would be to define the concert of Europe. What did I mean by that? What is the concert of Europe? Paragraph 3 would be, well, what is liberalism? You're saying in your thesis statement that the concert of Europe had elements of realist and liberalist theory. Therefore, what is liberalist theory? Your reader knows nothing. So paragraph 3, what is liberalist theory? Paragraph 4, likewise, what is realist theory? This is an opportunity for you, in a paragraph, to succinctly tell your reader what realist theory is. Well, coming down then into paragraph 5, how does the concert of Europe show evidence of realist theory? Paragraph 6, how does liberalism seem evident in the actions of the nation states in the concert of Europe. Now, both are going to be true. Looking at concert of Europe, I get that they were acting both as a realist would expect them to, but there are also very, very clear elements of liberal tradition in there as well. So, your concluding statement, as I suggest, is tell them you told them, is going to restate your thesis statement, perhaps recrafting it a little bit just for rhetoric's sake. But again, paragraph 1, to introduce your topic along with your thesis statement, the body of your essay to define what is in your thesis statement, the concert of Europe, liberalism, realism, and then how realism and liberalism are evidenced in the concert of Europe, and then to conclude. Again, to tell them you're going to tell them, and tell them you told them. Check. So, my friends, that brings us to our conclusion of our time together today, examining the theories and perspectives of international relations. This, as you know, maps to Chapter 3 in our textbook, Essentials of International Relations, the 8th edition by Karen Minkst. And I look forward to seeing you again next week when we touch on Chapter 4 and levels of analysis. As I suggested, we're going to be looking at levels of analysis and applying it to globalization, as Karen Minkst does in her book, but we'll be driving in many other examples as well. So, my friends, thank you for your forbearance. Enjoy writing your papers. I know I will enjoy reading them when you turn them in on the date outlined on the Canvas platform. Again, this is Mike Corelli for International Relations Online. Thank you.